You stopped explaining yourself a long time ago because no one ever seemed to understand what you were trying to say. At first, you thought you were simply going through a difficult season. You believed that eventually people would come back, conversations would feel natural again, opportunities would return, and the emptiness inside you would finally disappear. But instead, something stranger happened. The more you tried to fit in, the more invisible you became. Rooms filled with people somehow made you feel even lonelier. You smiled while carrying questions you could never put into words. You prayed prayers that sounded more like sighs than sentences. You wondered if perhaps you had done something wrong. Maybe God was disappointed with you. Maybe you had missed your purpose. Maybe everyone else had figured life out while you were somehow left behind. There were nights when the silence inside your home became almost unbearable because the quiet around you seemed to awaken every fear you had been trying to ignore. You would reach for your phone hoping someone had remembered you, only to find nothing waiting. You watched other people build friendships, relationships, families, careers, while your own life felt like it had been placed on pause. You kept asking yourself why your journey seemed so different, why every season of your life seemed marked by separation, why every place you thought would become home eventually reminded you that you did not truly belong there. Deep inside, you feared the answer was simple. Perhaps you simply were not enough. But what if the loneliness you have been fighting against is not the evidence of God's absence? What if it is happening in a place where something far deeper is quietly taking shape? What if the isolation you have spent years trying to escape is not the prison you imagined, but the workshop where God forms people before He entrusts them with greater responsibility? That possibility feels almost impossible to believe when all you can see is another empty day, another unanswered prayer, another invitation that never came, another relationship that slowly drifted away. Yet there is something about your story that refuses to fit the pattern of ordinary disappointment. You have survived moments that should have broken you completely. You have carried burdens no one knew existed because you became skilled at hiding pain behind ordinary conversations. You learned to laugh while your heart was exhausted. You learned to encourage others while secretly wondering who would encourage you. You learned how to keep moving, even when every step felt heavy. Somewhere along the way, you stopped expecting people to understand because every attempt seemed to leave you feeling even more alone. And perhaps the deepest wound was not simply that people left, it was that they often left after promising they never would. Their absence made you question your worth. It made you replay conversations over and over, searching for mistakes you could fix. You wondered whether you were too quiet, too emotional, too different, too intense, too thoughtful, too honest, too much, or somehow not enough. The questions became louder than the answers. If this season feels familiar, leave a comment and write "I understand," not because those two words solve everything, but because sometimes the first step toward healing is realizing you are not the only one carrying this hidden weight. There are people reading these words whose hearts recognize every emotion being described because isolation has become the language of their own lives. Yet even now, the deeper reason has not fully appeared. That is because preparation rarely announces itself while it is happening. It almost always feels like loss before it feels like purpose. Think about the moments when everything became quiet. Not peaceful quiet, but the kind that made your thoughts echo. The friendships became fewer. The invitations stopped. The conversations that once filled your days slowly disappeared. At first you fought against it. You tried harder. You reached out more often. You attempted to rebuild what seemed to be falling apart, but somehow every effort only confirmed what you feared. Doors continued closing. People continued changing. Seasons continued ending. What you did not realize was that God often allows certain voices to become silent before His own voice becomes clear. We naturally assume that growth happens in crowded places because crowds make us feel significant. We believe that being constantly surrounded by people means we are moving forward. Yet some of the deepest changes in a person's heart happen where no audience exists. Isolation has a painful way of removing distractions until we are finally left face to face with ourselves. That encounter is rarely comfortable. Without constant noise, hidden fears begin speaking. Old wounds resurface. Unresolved disappointments return. Memories we buried years ago somehow find their way back into our minds. It feels like everything is getting worse when in reality, what has been hidden is finally being exposed. God does not expose wounds to shame us. He exposes them because healed wounds become places of strength rather than lifelong weakness. Consider how many biblical stories include seasons where people were separated before they were sent. Before responsibilities increased, character was quietly developed. Before influence expanded, dependence upon God became deeper. Before public moments came private seasons, where faith had to survive without applause, without recognition, without visible success. Those moments often looked like delay to everyone watching from the outside. Yet heaven saw preparation where humanity saw failure. Perhaps your greatest frustration has been measuring your life against people whose assignments were never meant to resemble yours. Comparison quietly steals peace because it convinces us that every different path must be an inferior one. You look at someone else's timeline and wonder why yours feels slower. You look at someone else's relationships and wonder why yours have become smaller. You look at someone else's opportunities and wonder why your own seem delayed. But preparation cannot be rushed simply because someone else appears to be moving faster. Fruit picked before its season may look beautiful for a moment, but it cannot sustain life the way mature fruit can. Character develops at a pace that often feels painfully slow because lasting transformation rarely happens overnight. The isolation you dislike may actually be protecting something inside you that could not have survived the environment you wanted so desperately to enter. There are conversations you never joined that would have slowly reshaped your values. There are friendships you mourned losing that may have quietly pulled your heart away from who God was forming you to become. There are opportunities you begged God to open that perhaps would have demanded success before your identity was secure enough to carry it. Looking back, some closed doors eventually reveal themselves as acts of mercy rather than punishment. Yet while living through them, they simply feel cruel. That is why faith during isolation is so difficult. It asks us to trust before understanding arrives. It invites us to believe that unseen work can still be real. There is something extraordinary about the person who continues praying after months of silence. There is something beautiful about the heart that continues choosing kindness after repeated rejection. There is something deeply powerful about refusing bitterness when disappointment would seem justified. Those choices may never become headlines. No one applauds them. Few people even notice them. But heaven notices every quiet victory that happens when no one else is watching. Every time you choose forgiveness instead of resentment. Every time you choose hope instead of surrender. Every time you decide to speak gently after life has treated you harshly. Every one of those moments shapes who you are becoming. Isolation often reveals whether our identity depends upon being seen by people or being known by God. That realization changes everything because it moves the center of our confidence away from human approval and toward divine faithfulness. You begin discovering that your worth was never determined by how many people stayed. Your value was never measured by how often your phone rang. Your purpose was never established by the number of invitations you received. The God who formed you was never surprised by your lonely seasons. He was already present inside them long before you recognized him there. There will come a day when you look back at this difficult chapter and realize that many of the qualities you treasure most were born during days you once wanted to escape. Your patience grew there. Your compassion deepened there. Your ability to recognize hurting people developed there because you learned what hidden pain actually feels like. Your dependence upon God became genuine there because every other source of security slowly disappeared. None of those gifts could have been manufactured through comfort alone. Sometimes the quiet becomes the classroom where eternity shapes temporary lives. And if these words are awakening something inside your heart, share your own experience in the comments. Someone else reading your testimony may realize they are not walking through isolation alone. Sometimes the encouragement we desperately needed becomes the encouragement we unexpectedly offer another person. Even now, before every answer has appeared, before every prayer has been understood, before every reason has become clear, there is still hope quietly growing beneath the surface. The season has not ended yet. The story has not finished yet. The silence is not empty, simply because you cannot yet hear everything God is accomplishing within it. The deepest preparation often happens where no one else is looking, and perhaps that is exactly why this chapter, painful as it has been, is becoming one of the most meaningful parts of your journey. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that does not come from working too many hours or carrying too many responsibilities. It comes from constantly wondering why your life seems to move through seasons that no one else around you appears to experience. You begin to notice that every time you finally feel connected to a group of people, something changes. Circumstances shift, relationships fade, directions separate. It happens often enough that you eventually stop expecting permanence. You smile when people say they will always be there, but somewhere inside, experience has taught you to prepare for another goodbye. You do not become cold because you want to. You become careful because your heart remembers every disappointment, and perhaps the hardest part is that no one sees this quiet transformation taking place within you. They see someone who appears independent, calm and capable. They do not see the countless moments you wished someone would simply ask how you were really doing, and wait long enough to hear the honest answer. You became the strong one because life seemed to require it, but strength can become a lonely place when no one realizes that even the strongest hearts grow tired. There were mornings when getting out of bed felt like an act of faith, not because dramatic tragedy had happened overnight, but because another ordinary day of unanswered questions can weigh just as heavily as a single painful event. You kept moving forward because stopping never seemed like an option. Yet there were moments when you quietly wondered how much longer this season could possibly last. You never stopped believing in God, but you sometimes struggled to recognize what He was doing. You read stories of hope, listened to messages about purpose, prayed for wisdom, and still found yourself facing another day that looked almost exactly like the one before it. Waiting has a unique way of testing faith because it asks us to continue trusting without providing immediate evidence that anything is changing. It slowly reveals whether we are following God only when we understand Him, or whether we are willing to keep walking even when the path disappears into the fog. This is where many people assume that God has become distant, but often the opposite is true. The teacher does not abandon the student during the most important lesson simply because the classroom becomes quiet. Some lessons require silence because noise would prevent the heart from hearing them. Think about how many parts of your personality were built through circumstances you never would have chosen. Your ability to notice people who feel left out probably came from remembering what it felt like to be overlooked. Your patience with broken people may have been born from recognizing your own need for grace. Your willingness to listen instead of immediately judging others may have grown because you know how painful it is to be misunderstood. None of those qualities were developed through ease. They emerged through seasons that seemed unfair while you were living them. This is one of the mysteries of spiritual growth. God often creates beauty from experiences that never felt beautiful while they were unfolding. The process itself can feel confusing, because transformation usually happens so gradually that you do not recognize it until much later. Like a tree growing underground, before anyone notices its branches reaching toward the sky, much of what God develops inside a person remains invisible for a long time. We live in a world that celebrates visible achievement while quietly overlooking invisible character. Yet heaven measures success differently. Patience matters, integrity matters, humility matters, quiet faithfulness matters. The decision to keep loving after being hurt matters. The choice to remain honest when dishonesty would be easier matters. These are victories that may never receive public recognition, but they shape the kind of person who can be trusted with greater influence without being destroyed by it. Imagine if every prayer you asked God to answer immediately had actually been granted at the exact moment you requested it. Would you have possessed the wisdom to carry those blessings well? Would your identity have remained secure if success had arrived before your character matured? Would recognition have strengthened your dependence upon God, or slowly replaced it with dependence upon yourself? These are uncomfortable questions because they invite us to consider that delay is not always denial. Sometimes delay becomes protection against receiving something before our hearts are prepared to handle it. A child may believe a closed door represents rejection, while a loving parent understands that opening it too soon would create unnecessary danger. In much the same way, There are seasons when God lovingly withholds what we desperately desire, because He sees dimensions of the future that remain hidden from us. This does not erase the pain of waiting, but it does transform its meaning. Waiting ceases to be empty time and becomes meaningful formation. You begin realizing that God is not simply preparing circumstances around you. He is preparing the person who will eventually step into those circumstances. That distinction changes how you interpret your entire journey. Instead of asking only when something will happen, you slowly begin asking who you are becoming while it has not yet happened. Those questions produce a different kind of faith, one that is less dependent upon visible progress and more rooted in quiet trust. There were days when you believed nothing significant was happening because externally your life appeared almost unchanged. Yet internally, small shifts were taking place. You found yourself responding with more peace to situations that once would have overwhelmed you. You became slower to react in anger, faster to extend compassion, more willing to forgive, less desperate for constant approval, more comfortable sitting quietly with God instead of filling every empty moment with distractions. Those changes may seem ordinary, but they represent profound spiritual growth. They are evidence that isolation has not simply surrounded you, it has been reshaping you. This realization often arrives unexpectedly. One day you find yourself encouraging someone else who is walking through a season remarkably similar to the one you thought was meaningless. Suddenly your own pain becomes language that helps another person survive theirs. The tears you once wished had never fallen become part of the compassion through which someone else encounters hope. You discover that healed wounds often become places from which God ministers to others. This does not mean God delights in suffering. Rather, it reveals His extraordinary ability to redeem suffering so that nothing endured in faith is ultimately wasted. Even your questions have value because they make your faith honest instead of superficial. God has never been intimidated by sincere questions offered from a humble heart. Throughout Scripture, faithful people cried out in confusion, grief, fear, and longing. Their questions did not disqualify them from God's love. Instead, those moments often became places where their relationship with Him grew deeper. Faith is not pretending every emotion is positive. Faith is continuing to bring every emotion into God's presence, instead of allowing despair to isolate you completely. There is a difference between feeling alone and actually being abandoned. Isolation often convinces us those experiences are identical, but they are not. Feelings can become powerful storytellers, yet they do not always tell the whole story. There may be evenings when your emotions insist that you have been forgotten, while the truth remains that God is quietly sustaining you in ways you cannot yet perceive. Consider how many times you thought you would not make it through a particular season, yet somehow you did. The strength may not have arrived months in advance. It appeared one day at a time, exactly when it was needed. Looking back, you can probably identify moments when grace carried you before you even recognized it. That same grace continues working now, even if today's chapter feels unfinished. The temptation during isolation is to define your entire identity by your current circumstances. You begin saying things like "I am alone" instead of "I am experiencing loneliness." Those statements seem similar, but they are profoundly different. One describes a temporary experience. The other attempts to define who you are. God never intended your difficult season to become your permanent identity. You are not your rejection. You are not your disappointment. You are not your unanswered questions. You are not the relationships that ended or the opportunities that never materialized. Those experiences are chapters within your story, but they are not the title of your story. The God who lovingly formed you continues writing beyond the pages you can currently see. Sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply refusing to believe that today's pain has the final word. That refusal is not denial. It is hope rooted in the character of a faithful God whose purposes extend beyond the limits of our immediate understanding. Perhaps you still cannot explain why your road has included so much solitude. Perhaps some questions remain unanswered. That does not mean your journey lacks meaning. It simply means the full picture has not yet been revealed. And until it is, every quiet prayer, every faithful step, every unseen act of obedience continues becoming part of the person God is lovingly shaping. even when the only witness to that sacred work seems to be him alone. One day, without even realizing when it happened, you will notice something that once seemed impossible. The silence that used to terrify you will no longer have the same power over your heart. It will not be because every prayer has been answered, or because every lonely chapter has suddenly disappeared. It will be because somewhere along this journey, God quietly changed you. The same isolation that once felt like an empty room slowly became a place where your soul learned to breathe differently. The desperation that once made you chase every relationship began giving way to a deeper peace that could not be manufactured by human attention alone. You will remember how there was a time when being ignored immediately made you question your value. A delayed response, an invitation you never received, a friendship that slowly faded, or someone choosing another path would instantly awaken old fears. You believed every closed door carried a message about your worth, but little by little, almost too gradually to notice, something remarkable started happening. Your confidence stopped depending entirely on who stayed and who left. Your identity became less fragile because it was being rooted somewhere much deeper than human approval. That transformation did not happen during moments of celebration. It happened during ordinary mornings, when no one saw you continue praying. It happened during evenings, when you opened Scripture, even though your emotions felt empty. It happened every single time you chose faith over bitterness, even when bitterness seemed easier to justify. Growth rarely announces itself with dramatic moments. More often, it whispers through thousands of quiet decisions that seem insignificant while we are making them. Looking back, you may realize that God was answering some of your prayers in ways you never expected. Perhaps you prayed for strength, while hoping He would remove every difficult circumstance. Instead, He patiently developed resilience within you. Perhaps you prayed for wisdom, while expecting immediate clarity. Instead, He taught you how to trust Him before understanding everything. Perhaps you prayed to become more like Christ, without realizing that such a prayer would involve learning forgiveness after betrayal, patience during delay, humility through disappointment, compassion through suffering, and hope in seasons where nothing around you appeared hopeful. These lessons cannot simply be taught. They must be lived. They become part of who you are through experience. This is why preparation often feels hidden. You are becoming someone before you are doing something. In a culture that constantly asks what you have accomplished, God is often asking who you are becoming. That question reaches much deeper. Success can impress people while character honors God. Achievement can happen quickly, but maturity usually grows slowly. Influence may appear overnight, yet integrity is built one quiet decision at a time. The world celebrates what is visible. Heaven rejoices over what is invisible. Every temptation you quietly resisted. Every act of kindness no one thanked you for. Every prayer you whispered through tears. Every moment you remained faithful when nobody would have blamed you for giving up. None of those moments were forgotten. The Father who sees what happens in secret has never overlooked a single one. Sometimes we imagine that purpose begins the day something extraordinary happens, but perhaps purpose has been unfolding all along. Perhaps every difficult conversation, every season of waiting, every lonely evening, every disappointment, every unanswered question has been preparing your heart to carry something far more valuable than temporary success. A heart that has been softened instead of hardened by pain becomes a safe place for others. A person who has walked through darkness without losing hope becomes someone who can gently lead others toward light. The compassion you carry tomorrow may exist because of the tears you shed yesterday. Your patience with struggling people may come from remembering how patiently God carried you through your own confusing seasons. This is one of the beautiful mysteries of redemption. God does not simply remove brokenness. He transforms it into something that reflects His grace. Think about the people who have encouraged you the most. Were they usually those whose lives had always been easy? Or were they the ones whose words carried weight because they had suffered, trusted God anyway, and emerged with gentleness instead of resentment? Pain does not automatically produce wisdom, but surrendered pain often does. When suffering is placed into God's hands instead of becoming an excuse for hopelessness, He shapes it into compassion, humility, perseverance, and quiet strength. That is why some of the strongest believers are also the kindest. They know what it feels like to need mercy. They remember what it was like to feel unseen. They recognize hidden pain because they have lived through it themselves. If you are still walking through isolation today, perhaps your greatest temptation is believing that your life is standing still. But standing still externally does not mean nothing is happening internally. Seeds remain invisible long before they become trees. Foundations disappear beneath buildings that eventually stand for generations. Pregnancy is hidden long before new life is introduced to the world. Some of God's most important work happens beneath the surface, where human eyes cannot evaluate progress. We often become discouraged because we measure growth using visible results. God measures growth by transformed hearts. There may come a time when people suddenly notice qualities in you they cannot explain. They will describe your peace during difficult situations. They will admire your wisdom. They will wonder why you remain calm when others panic. They will be encouraged by your compassion. What they may never fully understand is that those qualities were not created overnight. They were formed during years that looked ordinary from the outside, but were sacred from heaven's perspective. Every lonely prayer became another stone in the foundation. Every season of waiting strengthened your trust. Every disappointment loosened your grip on temporary things and gently redirected your heart toward eternal ones. What once looked like wasted years may eventually become the very years that prepared you most deeply for whatever God places before you next. You do not need to force your way into significance because your identity has already been secured by the one who knows you completely. You do not need to compete for attention because your worth was never established through popularity. You do not need to fear that isolation has ruined your future because God has always specialized in bringing redemption from places people least expect. Throughout history, He has repeatedly shown that hidden seasons often precede meaningful service, not because isolation itself is the goal, but because hearts shaped in quiet places are less likely to be controlled by pride when visible opportunities finally arrive. Even if your future looks different from what you originally imagined, that does not mean it will be less meaningful. Sometimes God lovingly dismantles our smaller dreams because He is forming a heart capable of embracing something deeper than we could have designed ourselves. This does not guarantee a particular outcome, nor does it remove every uncertainty about tomorrow. But it does offer something stronger than certainty about circumstances. It offers confidence in God's unchanging character. His faithfulness is not measured by how quickly life changes. His love is not determined by how many doors remain closed today. His presence is not dependent upon whether you currently feel it. He remains the same through seasons of abundance and seasons of waiting, through moments of celebration and moments of grief, through chapters filled with people and chapters marked by solitude. If you have listened this far, perhaps that is because some part of your heart has quietly recognized itself in this story. Perhaps you have spent years believing isolation meant abandonment, when in reality it has been inviting you into a deeper dependence upon the God who has never stopped walking beside you. You may still have questions, and that is all right. You may still have days when loneliness feels heavy, and that does not make your faith weak. Continue bringing every burden to the Lord. Continue trusting His timing, even when it stretches beyond your expectations. Continue believing that He can redeem what you cannot yet explain. One day, you may look back and realize that the place you once begged God to rescue you from became the very place where He quietly prepared you to become the person you were always meant to be. And when that realization finally arrives, you will understand that although isolation changed many things about your life, it never changed the most important truth of all. You were never forgotten. You were never abandoned. Even in the quietest season, even when no one else understood your journey, the God who called you continued shaping your heart with patience, love, and purpose, proving that His presence was never absent from your loneliness, but faithfully at work within it all along.